a lot of folks in Southern California think of the beach as a parking lot and a beach, but we're talking about a vast blue wilderness that is literally off our borderlands. Next slide. But I wanted first, if I was there, I would have been effusively thanking Callisto and the North American Development Bank, because what I wanted to just connect everybody. If you're thinking about the Colorado River, then you need to think about the ocean, because at the end of the day, the Colorado River doesn't, we're not trying to just preserve the water in the Colorado River and make sure there's more water ending up in the wetlands of the upper Gulf of California. As our friends at Pronatura and many others, many of you have been working on for so long. But the western discharge site of the Colorado River is really the Pacific Ocean, because I want all of us to think about this, because the NADBank is, the EPA is, and I want to thank especially Ambassador Salazar, who's been in the field with us trying to figure this out and go to a system of water reuse as there's less and less water in the Colorado River. We're spending huge amounts of money to pump water from the Colorado River uphill using heavy fuel oil, creating some of the worst air quality and asthma problems and health problems in North America, using it inefficiently in Tijuana and northern Baja California, and then discharging it as raw sewage into the ocean up to the tune of between 30 and 50 million gallons a day. That's polluting an area of 20 miles in Mexico and the United States. In fact, our beach here in Imperial Beach, California has been closed. The southern part of our beach, which is a California state park at California Marine Protected Area, has been closed 100% of the time this year because of that sewage discharges in the Tijuana River, as well as just south of the border where. So the issue of water reuse and making sure that we're not sending Colorado River over the mountains to be discharged in the ocean as sewage is absolutely critical. So I want to thank all of you who are thinking about these things and working with agency partners to shift the way that we're looking at water, because it literally is connected to the ocean, and all of us who are using the ocean and that ocean wildlife that are going across the world. Next slide. Just keep going, the next slide. And so what I want to talk about is, because these aquatic ecosystems that exist along the border, they're blue carbon ecosystems. That means they store carbon. Next slide, mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass. We've got a bit of a disconnect here, but with the slides. But also, when you get that sewage, you're getting solid waste and sediment, which is essentially filling in the Tijuana Estuary, which is a National Estuarine Research Reserve. 70% of the tidal prism in the Tijuana Estuary, which is right on the border of the California State Park and National Estuarine Research Reserve, and then a federal wildlife refuge, as well as the California State Park. It's got it all. And then a county reserve just next to it has been filled in with sediment from erosion in Tijuana, as well as trash. That we've built a trash boom in Tijuana to do that. California State Parks now spends more money managing a trash boom to stop trash from going into an estuary than it does actually managing the state park, the rest of the state park. Next slide. But here's the good news. We've got lots of aquatic ecosystems, wetlands, mangroves, and coastal salt marshes that we're working on conserving to preserve that carbon back down in the soil. Next slide. Next slide. Because we know that the carbon that's captured in these ecosystems is significant, will help us address the mitigation component of climate change, but also help us adapt to rising seas, that we need to move these systems eastward as sea level rises. There's been a really great movement at the national and state levels in California and Mexico to address blue carbon. And we've had 2 forums in Mexico on blue carbon with participation obviously from NGOs and state agencies, as well as CONAMP, and some are not. So we're very happy about that. And in California, we have a blue carbon collaborative. So a lot of great work. And I'm going to say that, as always, the leadership is coming from the NGO sector, the scientific community, especially Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and our colleagues in Mexico, who are really doing some great work on understanding the carbon capture that's going on in these systems, but also the carbon that's released when you destroy them. Next slide. And this includes salt marsh wetlands and mangrove ecosystems all the way down from California down to southern Baja California. Next slide. In California, we're really working in Baja California. We acknowledge our partners at Pronatura, Terra Peninsular, and Proesteros who've been working in Baja California along with Wild Coast, Costa Salvaje. And then all of our partners in Southern California especially have been working on wetland restoration and conservation. It's a big movement that's creating jobs to help do the restoration and getting kids involved, but critical policy mechanisms that are going into place to institutionalize these mitigation and adaptation strategies. Next slide. And then in Mexico, what's been really exciting is to see that finally, I think as Ernesto Enkerling told me, many of you know Ernesto, whatever it takes to preserve biodiversity, topophilia, biophilia, whatever it takes. But what's the new part of this is really getting communities and the Mexican National Park Service, CONAMP, and some are not behind efforts to mangrove afforestation, reforestation, to look at adaptation and mitigation measures around blue carbon. So to make sure we're preserving mangroves, but also expanding their footprint. Next slide. And I think a lot of us who are working in this field are finally excited that we've eliminated the nexus between economy and the environment. We know that if we're working to preserve these ecosystems, we can identify funds to hire local folks to work on reforestation and restoration efforts, which is very, very exciting. So we've been working, a lot of us have been working with fishing communities and especially women's cooperatives who may not be fishing, but they're very interested in preserving and restoring mangroves. Next slide. And I think for me, that's really where we're headed, whether it's the Colorado River or whether it's coastal and marine ecosystems and mangroves and salt marsh systems, getting people engaged in their stewardship and expanding those mitigation and adaptation strategies and making sure that we're really focused on and doubling down on natural climate solutions. Next slide. And we'll end here because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that every kid in California, especially in Baja California, has access to clean water, beautiful ocean aquatic systems, and that we really reimagine the borderlands and continue to advocate for biophilia and topophilia and making sure that people, sharks, whales, dolphins, sea turtles, and green aquatic ecosystems or blue carbon ecosystems have a chance to coexist in harmony and joy. So that's it. But I want to thank Calixto and his team at NADBank. I want to thank IBWC Commissioner and her team at the IBWC, Michael Regan, Secretary of the EPA, and Martha Guzman, and of course, Ambassador Salazar, who've all been in the field with us working on these issues, who've been very, very supportive. I cannot understate or overstate that it's a really important team that we have, and we really appreciate their support for all of these issues, water reuse and natural climate solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Serge. That was great. Faye?
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Faye Hartman. I'm the Conservation Director for the Southwest region with American Rivers. Really excited to be here with all of you today. And thank you to Jen and Beth and everyone at the Salazar Center for having me. I'm really excited to chat more with all of you. So today I'm going to chat with everybody about the report 10 strategies for building climate resilience in the Colorado River Basin. And before I dive into the report, I think we can all appreciate the fact that we've been experiencing a pretty big shift in the Southwest, whether you're in the Colorado Basin or the Rio Grande, over the last few years, significant fires, higher temperatures, variable precipitation, and then of course, low runoff. And the climate trend is kind of moving towards the extremes, as this graph shows. New approaches are needed to help communities, ecosystems adapt, respond, and mitigate the risks of climate change. So that is what brought about this report, the 10 strategies for climate resilience in the Colorado River Basin. American Rivers was really excited to work with a number of partners in the development of this report, including Martin and McCoy and Culp and Kelly, along with many conservation organizations who are present in this room, to create the report that basically identifies and describes climate resilient solutions for the Colorado River Basin, from the upper basin, the headwaters, down to the lower basin, the borderlands, to the delta. And while this report, as it says in the title, is focused on the Colorado River Basin, I do feel like a lot of these strategies are already happening in the Rio Grande Basin and can be kind of thought about and utilized in that context as well. I think both basins span states, two countries, cover a wide range of ecosystems, communities, economies, And it's important to remember that the river is connected, whether you're up in the headwaters area, in the upper basin, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, or in the borderlands region, Mexico, Arizona. We are all reliant on the same system, and things that happen to increase resilience in the upper basin, on tributaries or ecosystems, communities upstream, are also building resilience for communities downstream. We're all experiencing challenges, and we all rely on the Colorado River, and so working together to create these partnerships and identify solutions that improve resilience, reduce risk, to benefit communities and ecosystems are really important. So what's in the 10 strategies report? There's a lot. And as you can see on the screen here, the strategies that we looked at and that we identified go from those that are kind of more experienced on the right-hand side of the screen. Sorry, I'm like, wait, which way is it? On that side of the screen, all the way to those that are more theoretical and need more science and data to kind of fully understand. So things like urban and industrial conservation, thinking about how to use water more effectively, upgrading agricultural systems, irrigation, ditch improvements, new crop alternatives, so thinking about those crops that might use less water, forest management and restoration. Given this, the significant wildfires that we've been experiencing, how can we manage our forests better to think about system functionality and biodiversity? Regenerative agriculture, opportunities to improve soil health, biodiversity, watershed health, community health. Improving our naturally distributed storage, so restoring the key wetlands, wet meadows, riparian areas that provide that resilience for drought and wildfire, among other ecosystem service benefits. Retirement of coal plant water. How can we purchase or reallocate some of those water rights to go towards system water, environmental benefits, or other uses? And then those that are kind of more theoretical, covering reservoirs and canals, really thinking about implementing solutions that can reduce evaporation. And then finally, reducing dust on snow. What are some of the land management practices that can help reduce the dust on snow effect? So we had a couple of questions that we thought about when we were identifying these strategies. And our goal was that the strategies that we identified in the report would help to address at least 2 of these questions. And so here on this slide, you can see by the different investment strategies that we've identified, which questions they help to address. Adapt to ongoing shifts in climate, reducing pressure on existing water supplies, mitigating climate change, and then strengthening economic resilience, all that are important in the context and this framework of building resilience. So I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about 2 key strategies that we identified. So the first one is naturally distributed storage, or restoring our natural water infrastructure. Again, the wetlands, wet meadows, riparian areas that have significant resilience for people and the environment.
Para las personas y en el medio ambiente.
So by restoring these, our natural water infrastructure, we're able to enhance drought and fire resilience by re-wetting the sponge, improving connection between groundwater and surface water, improve water quality, reduce erosion, and obviously has excellent habitat. 2 quick examples: the Yuma East Wetland Restoration Project in Yuma, Arizona, did an incredible job of bringing together a number of diverse partners to restore over 350 acres of habitat along the Colorado River in Yuma. And it leveraged $8 million in all sorts of different levels of funding, which I think is a really excellent example of kind of the ability to improve habitat and also increase community livability. And then the Trail Creek Restoration Project, not in the borderlands area, but up in the headwaters of the Colorado, looking to improve stream and wetland health and enhance resilience in the upper watersheds of the basin. The next piece is investing in agriculture. Thinking about how agriculture is going to, obviously, a critical piece of climate resilience. American Rivers is really excited to be working with a number of different partners, agricultural stakeholders, to create a future where farming and ranching can thrive with less water, enhance resilience to drier conditions, and of course reduce pressure on our on rivers. And so thinking about what are opportunities to improve irrigation, to think about innovative solutions to identify regenerative agriculture opportunities, and then what are some of those new crop alternatives that use less water that we could think about. So next steps, the 10 strategies provides a really amazing framework to think about the different strategies that are going to help us achieve climate resilience in the basin. But what do we need? Demonstration projects. I think we all understand the power of seeing projects on the ground, bringing stakeholders, policymakers to these places, as we've heard about a lot this morning. They also help us to understand the benefits, see the knowledge, see the science in action. Financing, another key topic. We have unprecedented funding available at the federal level to help with these types of projects and really get us to scale faster. So how can we leverage the dollars and utilize the federal dollars that are available? And finally, research. The science, the data is really important to help us scale up these types of solutions across the Southwest. So last thing, as a part of the 10 strategies kind of process, when the bipartisan infrastructure law was created, we created a database that has federal funding opportunities broken down by the different strategies. That is available at 10strategies.net, and it's a great opportunity and provides kind of a breakdown by different entities of where funding is available. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Faye.
Hi, y'all. I'm John Dale from South Texas. I'm holding down the East End in this panel of the border. So I just want to kind of give you all an overview of the work that American Forest does in the region. It is, as you've heard from Dinah and some other folks on the panels yesterday, this is what we call the Lower Rio Grande Valley. So this is a 4-county area. What we generally talk about is Cameron, Hidalgo, Starr, and Willacy counties. And so, you know, it's this is the room to talk about it. This is the complexities that we face every day in trying to manage resources. So I'll give you all an overview as we go forward here. I wanted to talk just for one slide about our mission. American Forests, as you can see there, we create healthy and resilient forests. The key there is resilient forests. And so this is kind of the nexus with climate adaptation and those kinds of things. There's a lot of pre-existing reforestation efforts out there, but how can we bring resilience into those, climate resilience over time? And so that includes cities to wilderness. I actually work within our landscape level restoration department. We have an urban forestry piece that some of you are probably aware of that works in larger cities throughout the U.S. The Lower Rio Grande Valley is that gray area in between. It's an urbanizing area very quickly. We have Juarez, El Paso's population right now. We're at about, if you count Matamoros and Reynosa, that, you know, on the Rio Bravo side, and then you add up the valley communities, we're right at about 2.5 million residents right now, and that's projected to, you know, double by 2050. So this trajectory of restoration on public and private lands in the region, as we'll see here in the next few slides, it's an urban trajectory. What existed, you know, previously with working lands and that kind of thing, those will still be there. There's a lot of, you know, irrigated and dry land farming, and those are the things that put us on the map, if you will. You know, whether it was citrus or sugarcane or those. I have a background in the agricultural industry in South Texas as well, so I'm in a pretty good place to speak to that aspect of, on resource scarcity as well when it comes to what we've been talking about for the last couple of days on water. You know, it's all about the forestry innovation. That's where we are as an organization. And then the other piece of all this is, as others have alluded to, is building place-based partnerships. And you know, whether it be for the end goal of information sharing or actually moving the needle on some of these practices locally, that's what's most important. So we would like to say that we, you know, kind of, you know, specialize in those kinds of things throughout the U.S. I'm one member of a program that extends throughout the U.S. basically. So my colleagues are in the Sierra Nevada, Pacific Northwest, that kind of thing, and then the movement building piece. Sorry about that. How are we going to achieve these things sustainably over time? You know, it's one thing to talk about how we're going to do reforestation, and then, you know, what kinds of climate adaptation practices can we leverage the existing base of knowledge that we have on reforestation? Can we leverage that with climate change adaptation strategies and move that forward? So that's a little bit about American forest. So we'll talk about the geography here for those of y'all who may not know it as well. The Lower Rio Grande Valley, as I said, is these 4 counties, very southern tip of Texas. We basically are we straddle the Tamaulipan Biotic Province. We're basically the center of that. So it extends from basically San Antonio all the way down to Ciudad Victoria in Tamaulipas. So that's about a 400-mile stretch from north to south, and we're right in the middle of that. So the end result of that is the biodiversity that we have in the region is really, I mean, I'll go ahead and say it, it's really Tamaulipan biodiversity. It's so different from the rest of Texas, as many of y'all know. The numbers speak for themselves. If we're just looking at, species, 42% of all, butterfly, species recorded north of the border have been found in 4 counties in Texas. 58%, of bird species. So that we're talking about, I'll hit the biophilia thing again. I mean, it's like, wow. I mean, let's go to the valley and bird. I mean, it's that kind of thing, but it's so much more than that. When we talk about thorn forest, and this is semantics. I mean, whether we call it monte or thorn scrub or however we want to look at it, thorn forest is really almost like a rebranding, if you will, for us. But you do have areas on the east side, closer to Brownsville, so we're talking about 25 to 30 inches of rain per year on the east side around Brownsville. So you have, our last existing sable palm forest there on that one slide there. And then as you've got that gradient of precipitation as you move further out west, where you get down to, 10, 12 inches of precip a year, not too far away from the Chihuahuan Desert. So I'll go on to the next one there. So this is the issue at hand. We basically have 10% of this land cover left. We've lost it all pretty much in the last century, last 120 years, if you will. And that's kind of like a projection there. One of the Trembley's papers about 20 years ago, 1930s to 1980s to where we're at basically now. The 2001 is basically now. So that this is the issue. This is almost like I'm kind of like more or less a case study on this panel. But it's an area that, as we talked about earlier, is on an urban trajectory. Yet we have these populations of endangered species, threatened species that require connectivity in this fragmented landscape. So I wear a couple different hats for the organization. I chair the Thorn Forest Conservation Partnership. We're a small, growing network. We're about 3 years in. So this is school has been in session for me today. I mean, and yesterday. I mean, we're on the front end of this here in this region. I've just gotten so much input on mentally on where to go next steps. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the partnership. So we have kind of like a de facto network built over the last 3 years, local government, research, industry. Those goals, originally were built around ecosystem resilience and really biodiversity conservation. A lot of talk, obviously, about species like the ocelot. And what role does reforestation play in the recovery of that species? There's all these other side conversations about translocation or wildlife crossings, but how does reforestation interface with all of that? Because you need them all for the future of that species. And then the process. So what we came up with was what we call the conservation plan. I'll kind of blow through this here for a minute. This is kind of like our manifesto on where we would like to go with restoration over time, and this is a long-term process. Obviously, this is complementing a lot of the comprehensive conservation plans that DOI, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has come out with regionally over the last 30 years in the region, and they're our largest partner. So a lot of the work that we're piloting, most of the work that we're doing is piloting with Fish and Wildlife Service in South Texas. That is my DOI connection in that region. And so to complement all of that, we have this conservation plan that we put out. I encourage you all to kind of look that up. And this is where we would like to go. This is like a theoretical practice right now. A lot of those areas on there that are considered top potential restoration sites, We're already in the process of restoring. They are public lands. We've got about somewhere between about 7 and 9% of our lands based in the region, those 4 counties, as public lands. But guess what? The other 2/3 are private lands. So we'll talk about that probably in the questions section. And then, let's see here. We got the next one. Incorporate climate change planning. So that's the meat and potatoes of this conversation. What are we doing? What is American Forest doing? And then what are we doing through this partnership to kind of advance that? The challenge for the region, of others has spoke to, is intensified drought, but also intensified and more frequent storms. We are the western Gulf Coast. We do get hit by hurricanes of varying intensities. So these are things we need to plan for. If we're talking about reforestation, this is a long-term process. I mean, we need to be turning the wheel. Climate adaptation, we need to be turning the wheel right now on stuff we want to see decades down the road. I run into this conversation pretty regularly with collaborators. I don't have rotation on this is not a U.S. Forest Service unit, so I don't run into rotation. We're supposed to plan it the right way and kind of walk away after a few years. So that's a significant challenge. We can talk more about that. We are involved in seed collection, seed banking for over 50 hardwood species. We have 1 conifer species in South Texas. Everything else is hardwood. So we're in the process of starting that up as well. Sponsored research is extremely important. We can talk about more of that. And then this intersection of community resilience, conservation, and climate kind of speaks for itself. Economic impact, how many other nursery growers, seedling nursery growers can we bring into the picture? What about workforce development, the economic impact? I mean, $300 million per year on ecotourism just for that region. And then environmental literacy, the importance of that. We'll talk a bit more about that. And then those big picture items there. Just some acknowledgements there. Obviously, partners and sponsors that are helping us achieve this on the ground.
All right, thank you for that. That was wonderful. So we already have many questions in Slido from the audience, but I'd like to start with one that's in here that's about scale and the scale of the work that each of you are doing. This type of work at different scales, from place-based all the way to whole basin and up and down a peninsula. When you're thinking about the work that you've been doing, how can we scale up some of this work? How can the impact of the work that you do be scaled up? And John, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, so we, locally in the region, we are working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to restore upwards of 200 to 300 acres per year, and that is, if we're looking at this, projection of 80,000 acres over, at some point to create that ideal connectivity situation for biodiversity in the region. We're going to need to start restoring a lot more. We need the reforestation capacity to kind of step that up at every level, really. Whether it's expanding the number of growers, or whether it's actually working on American Forest doesn't do land acquisition. We've got partners within that network, whether it's TCF, the Conservation Fund, some other individuals that can speak to that. But as far as shared stewardship goes, that's the issue. At the other end of that spectrum is working in communities where we're doing 1 acre restorations, demonstration plots that are kind of in these para-urban areas where the urbanization is spreading out, but it hasn't really covered that area yet. That is that's really a down payment on the future. Exposing this larger cross section of the region's population. Folks alluded to it yesterday. We've got hundreds of colonias in the border area, the 4-county area, who is professing to do outreach on things like reforestation with that demographic, with that component. We have what we call world birding centers in some of the urban municipal areas. But how many people can really make it to those areas on a regular basis and really kind of, take advantage of, wildlife watching opportunities, or really just relaxing that quality of life aspect. So we're working on all that to be continued.
And Faye, I mean, you're already working at a huge basin-wide scale, but the framework sort of speaks to a lot of smaller projects within that would have to be scaled up. So how are the partners within the framework thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I feel like scale is one that we all talk about a lot, and I wish there was a secret recipe that we could all work on. But I do think there's a couple of key pieces when it comes to scale. I think the first one, and John just mentioned this, and I talked about it a bit in my slides, are these demonstration projects, the various kind of, from the 10 strategies perspective, kind of showing the benefits of some of these strategies on the ground is really critical, and sort of being able to create that scale, showing what sorts of resilience benefits they provide for communities. I think the other piece that is critical to both identifying, getting demonstration projects off the ground, and then moving them forward is just the establishment of partnerships. That's obviously been another really key theme throughout today's conversation, but having those kind of partners with many different agencies, NGOs, private landowners, tribes, to understand and identify and look at different strategies that can be kind of grown across a broader landscape. And the other thing that I think is really important is just funding, obviously. And there's a big piece that we have the opportunity to kind of utilize funding, this incredible amount of funding that we have to get to scale, to work together through the various partnerships that maybe have started or that can be started over the next few years, to put this money to work and to see really great projects implemented and then grown across the Southwest as a whole.
Great. And Serge, in WILDCOAST's work, what are some of the thoughts or challenges that you've had with scaling up the impact of the work that you all do? I think you might be on mute, Serge.
I think my colleagues are on the Mike Vargas, Aporno Tuda, Aida Navarro in the audience. All of us for the last really 20 years have worked very strategically and with the support of our foundation funders and agencies on both sides of the border, especially in Baja California, the peninsula, really think strategically about how to protect vast areas, mostly of aquatic wetlands, mangroves on the Pacific, San Ignacio Lagoon, Bahia Magdalena, the San Quintin, where Terra Peninsular is working extensively. All of us supported that effort. And then on the Gulf of California, obviously so much centered around the Upper Gulf, Bahia de Los Angeles, so through national parks, federal conservation concessions, mangrove concessions, innovative tools. I think we're really where the rubber has met the road, and a lot more micro scale things are stewardship and private lands conservation. I want to acknowledge my colleagues and partners who have really worked on that in Baja California. I think that's the new frontier, right? How do we work with ejidos, private landowners, these cooperatives on these stewardship projects? So I think that's the micro scale restoration and climate change adaptation piece of these vast protected area projects we've worked on. And then in California, 10% of our wetlands remain. The state of California, I think, and every Friends of a Wetland or conservation organization is focused on their backyard wetland. There's a fairly robust portfolio of protected coastal wetlands. They're very small though. And so I think really the focus, especially like in San Diego County, Orange County, has been on restoration focus with the Ocean Protection Council in California, the California Coast Conservancy, and other agencies really, and the Fish and Wildlife Service for their wildlife refuges, really focusing on the adaptation piece to move eastward. And Caltrans, when they're doing infrastructure projects now, are funding a lot of massive restoration projects. The mitigation component is brand new, the blue carbon component, and I think that provides another window for climate action planning so that mitigation funds aren't sent to Kansas wind farms, although Kansas wind farms are great, that could be reinvested back in blue carbon coastal salt marsh restoration projects that you can demonstrate capture some carbon. So I think, and then the other component of that in California has been the marine protected area component. We have 500,000 acres of marine protected areas that go right to the US-Mexico border from the border with Oregon. And those include seagrass, right? So I think a lot of the climate adaptation planning and then 30 by 30 now has really been focused around that component. So it's really, I think, about scale and then the micro scale, community-based restoration programs. And I think just like in on the eastern area of the border, these workforce development programs, getting people engaged in restoration is so exciting. And it's great to see kids and folks, young people getting dirty and muddy, helping save the planet and save the, in our case, save the ocean.
That's great. And hopefully they're getting paid for that, getting muddy as well. So
people getting paid to save the environment, great work.
Serge, you touched on something that there's a few questions in the Slido that relate to, like, how do we better link the work that we're doing around climate resiliency to some of these climate funding sources, whether it's carbon markets, linking ecosystem services, and that type of thing. And so I wonder if maybe each of you could talk a little bit more about that, and then Serge, maybe we'll start with you, and if you want to just talk a little bit about some of the the barriers and challenges that you've faced with the blue carbon piece of that, and how, what you guys are doing to resolve that.
Yeah, look, I think all of us were looking at blue carbon and carbon sequestration. Obviously it was like, oh, here's the instant pot of, the pot at the end of the rainbow of cash that's going to fund these carbon markets, going to fund wetland restoration and putting people to work. That's been challenging, obviously, because Mexico's interested, and they should be, their own internal carbon market. That hasn't really developed the way it should be. It's focused on forests and in tropical forests, especially. We're working on a national policy level to adapt that to coastal ecosystems, but most of those ecosystems are under, obviously, the ownership of the federal government in the maritime, in the coastal zone. It's called the Zofamat area in Mexico, or in waters. So that makes it more challenging in terms of carbon markets. And I think there's a big push to look at ejidos now throughout Mexico. So there's some mechanisms there. I think for all of us that do topophilia and biophilia, at the end of the day, markets are irrelevant. We're committed to on-the-ground conservation and working with communities to make that happen, and attracting private funders who are like the whole workforce plus biodiversity restoration or conservation, ecosystem restoration that has a carbon component. So that's where we're focused on now. And in California, I think it's the same thing. It's looking at how we're working with the County of San Diego to come up with, for their climate action plan, to identify whether it's possible, again, to monetize wetland restoration so that maybe some of these mitigation funds are put into natural climate solutions versus outside the county, offset issues. I think that's become a big issue politically. And so we're not saying that we shouldn't, and sometimes that gets caught up in emissions reductions versus natural climate solutions. No one wants to get in that battle. It's a lose-lose, which is why I love connecting what's going on with the Colorado River, and power generation and sewage to, healthy ecosystems. So I'll stop there.
Great. John, in the work that American Forest is doing, have you incorporated any of that sort of ecosystem service payment type work, or is that, you're still growing your program?
We're growing the program. I mean, carbon finance is out there within American Forest. I'm not there yet with my program in South Texas. The carbon sequestration value is not negligible. But I think kind of what Serge was talking about, these points, that there's a really strong public service component in every layer of individual who's involved with reforestation in South Texas, whether it's the nursery owners or the public land managers or the NGOs. So I think that's going to win out in the short term, but to capitalize on that private lands base that we need to do reforestation on, that's going to have to be there going forward at some point. We're going to have to dig into that and get real good about that, because NRCS programs, state acres for wildlife enhancement, some of these pieces that come down through USDA, the cost shares are not going to cut it in the geography I'm working in with the development pressure and whatnot. So we've got to get there pretty quick.
Faye, I know you touched on funding and financing and the strategies, but is that an idea that's being thought to be leveraged in the framework?
It's not necessarily called out explicitly in the 10 strategies report, but I do think collaborative financing, so thinking about the opportunity for private and public funding, philanthropic dollars to come together to kind of leverage each other and have a bigger impact, is something that definitely is kind of happening. There's a number of, I think, good examples across the West where the sort of collaborative model is is being piloted to see how it can work, whether it's some of the work that's happening in the Yuba watershed in California, or there's and I'm totally blanking on the name of this right now, but there's an initiative in Southwest Colorado that's looking at some wildfire resilience work that is thinking about this collaborative financing approach. And so I do think that is going to be a part of the bigger financing conversation into the future.
So there's a few questions in the Slido that relate to how we measure and monitor and track the impact of the climate work. And that in some ways that ties back to maybe some of the financing stuff as well if you're doing carbon markets. But can any of you speak to how within your different case studies you're thinking about the monitoring and the tracking of whatever your climate goals are, and what some of the challenges are with that? And Serge, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, no, that's a great question, and I think that's at the heart of these carbon financing mechanisms that are extremely challenging, obviously, to obtain these credits, and you have to demonstrate that. And that's the brand new science in around blue carbon. So I just want to acknowledge the work of people like Ezekiel Escora at UC Riverside, Octavia Berto at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Catherine Lovelock at the Queensland University in Australia, and Fernanda Dame, who's also in Australia, who's from Mexico, that have been doing this really important work on looking at carbon. And Matt Costa at Scripps, who's now gotten a postdoc somewhere else, but who's been really looking at the carbon storage rates in coastal salt marsh as well as mangroves, and trying to sort of come up with some numbers that would help us quantify this and look at impact. So we're starting to we're doing those systematic measuring in areas of carbon storage, what's already in the ground, and areas we're going to start restoring. And I think that helps us provide a framework for sort of the before and after projects. But that's the challenge at the moment, and we're working with a number of organizations to help kind of figure that out and do much better. I think the seagrass component is more challenging, and that's all brand new. But I think that's why it's important to continue, not wait for that to get solved, and really focus on the conservation and restoration piece, to move forward with that. But to get public agencies to start acknowledging this issue as well, to start addressing it.
Thank you for that. John, I mean, you've already mentioned that your program's not quite at a carbon market space, but you do have climate goals built into your program. So, how is your program thinking about tracking that, and are there particular challenges with it?
Yeah, I mean, I would take it a step back. I know we're kind of looking at that, the climate goals there. I would take it a step back and say we need to cover the bases as far as in terms of reforestation. What kind of habitat are we providing at the end of the day to these? Are we actually moving the needle on species conservation? Those kinds of things. Those kinds of questions will come up later anyway. Whether it's a biodiversity credit or a carbon finance credit, those kinds of things. So I mean, in terms of how we hold ourselves accountable. I said earlier that we kind of walked away. Well, we never really do that. I mean, there's years of monitoring that goes into the post-plant environment. How is that developing? So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's from a developmental perspective for my program, that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, and I think when I think about the 10 strategies framework, if you remember the slide that had like all of the strategies on it, we had from those that are kind of well known to the theoretical. And I think the science and the data and the research is really important to help us understand a bit better, particularly those strategies that were more towards the kind of newer and in the theoretical concept, to understand those benefits a bit better and be able to quantify them. And so I think the additional funding and really a focus on the research and the science to collect that data and to develop a monitoring framework that can help us to understand that is going to be really important. And I will say, it was exciting through the various federal funding buckets that have come down, whether it's bipartisan infrastructure law or the Inflation Reduction Act, that there has been a good amount of money that is kind of put towards research and science, and I think that's a really positive step forward, because we definitely need more, especially for those, like I said, those areas that are sort of emerging and new, and getting that information out there and getting people comfortable and seeing and kind of a more quantifiable benefit.
So we have a few questions in the chat around partnerships and the process that you all have gone through to develop those partners. You've all touched on some of your partners, but I'm wondering if you could speak to, the partners that are still missing from the table, and how, if at all, you're thinking about, equity and bringing more, voices who haven't been to the table into the work that you do, and maybe I'll just start with you this time.
Yeah, sure. The premise with the partnership, among so many other things, is how do we, of course, how do we further conservation in South Texas? But at the end of the day, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. And everybody has their classic scenario of land managers coming in and kind of doing that. I certainly have my instances of that in South Texas. New management comes in and suddenly wants to take the process and we're not going to tree tube half of what we plant. We're going to that kind of thing. And I can understand and appreciate the value of that for like a research endeavor, that kind of thing. But there's what we know, before we started tree tubing and that kind of thing. I mean, we were like single digits in survivorship. 1 year post plant, and now we're in a lot of those cases with the right conditions, we're like in excess of 90%. So that was like those kinds of things are game changers. But as far as the partnership angle goes, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Interesting comment earlier today for the Rio Grande, my part of the Rio Grande Basin, and this is by no means a reflection on any one particular group. There's been a lot, and there's a place for activism at the table, but what we need is solutions. What we need is groups bringing solutions to the table. We can go under the border wall here. We can talk about all of that. We can talk about how the border wall is built into a protective levee that blocks off. Yeah, I mean it will be walling off the populated part of the region when it's completed, finished out. But we don't even this speaks to the science angle that you were talking about earlier. The need to kind of invest in that sponsored research. And I talked to a couple folks yesterday. We don't even know what a climax community of riparian forest really looks like in the region anymore. And the prospects of doing like major restoration in those areas, it just isn't there for us, like it would be for Jen, and that kind of thing. So that's where we need to get busy, or nonprofits like American Forest and the stakeholder group, the Thorn Forest Conservation Partnership. That's where we need to get seriously busy and start building those bridges if we ever want to see those allocations for restoration, because they just don't exist now. I mean, as you know, it's over allocated, and population growing, and there's still the ag part to be met. Those obligations from the Rio Grande's allocation. So I need to bring more. I would like to bring more activist groups to the table, but it's got to be constructive with the partnership, because we want to get end goals out of that, and we don't want to close the door with private landowners and that kind of thing. If we know instinctively that Texas is a 95 to 97% privately owned state, we know instinctively that we've got an uphill climb with working with private landowners. And there's no one-size-fits-all recipe for restoration in the region either. I don't want to give that implication. We plant at densities of 1,000 seedlings per acre on DOI lands. That's not going to happen on private lands, especially with folks looking for, 30-year agreements with NRCS, those kinds of things. Yeah, more people need to be at the table for sure.
And Faye, obviously the framework itself is an outcome of a large partnership, but there's always more voices that could be added to that. So maybe you could touch on that.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that more voices at the table is always better. I think you're able to understand, find shared value among many different partners, the more different groups and entities that are represented, whether it's, so not just having conservation organizations and agencies, but bringing in private landowners, bringing in tribal entities, bringing in, under other communities of color, agricultural stakeholders, having those different perspectives, I think is really important. I also think it's really important to remember and have conversations between urban and rural communities, because I think that's often can be a bit of a disconnect when you're thinking about projects, and in particular, like in the nature-based solutions lens, I think there are opportunities for these types of solutions, obviously in and a lot of the ones I touched on today are more in sort of rural areas, but I think in urban areas, I think somebody mentioned it earlier, but just the opportunities for whether it's nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, kind of whatever word or phrase people would want to use, there is an opportunity to kind of look at nature-based solutions within urban communities, and I think that's a really great way to bring in kind of some underrepresented voices and understand their community values and their needs, and how these types of climate resilient solutions can help to not only reduce the risk of climate but also improve community livability as well.
And Serge, you talked about a bunch of different partnerships that you formulated, but near the end you spoke briefly about sort of a new path or some new opportunities with ejidos, and maybe you could talk a little bit about what that looks like for WILDCOAST programs and what you're intending with that.
Yeah, first I didn't mention Johnny Torres he's in Sonora, a very well recognized mangrove researchers doing blue carbon work with us, but also with the Mexican Mexican Committee of Mangroves, has been very active in that front. The ejido work has been really, really important to a lot of the private land conservation and public concessions that have gone on, a lot of tools that our partners at ProNatura have helped develop in terms of private and public land conservation. So that's been critical. I think within that, you're looking at fishing co-ops, and also sort of like these women's co-ops have been developed. A lot of the spouses of fishermen, not that there aren't women fishermen, but a lot of people in these rural communities, women have gotten engaged in the restoration and stewardship component, especially in Laguna San Ignacio or San Ignacio Laguna and in the Bay of La Paz. And so I think to me, that's been like the next frontier. We're working with Conservation International now and expanding mangrove restoration projects in Oaxaca and Chiapas, and we're seeing that among indigenous communities, ejidos, and then women's co-ops as well. So I find that, and our staff are really been inspired by that. So I think that's one component. On the California side, I think what's been really, again, moving and inspiring is to see the real commitment, the Newsom administration, our state park staff, Ocean Protection Council, and California Coast Conservancy and the Coast Commission, all for really getting more funding to have NGOs work, getting more kids from underserved communities involved, sort of like the organizations that are working with underserved kids and in communities are now involved in the restoration, sort of conservation space. And I think that's been really healthy, as well as we receive funding and support from foundations we've hired a woman from an indigenous community who's now working with our 18 tribes in San Diego County and getting kids from tribal communities back on the land that they actually used to inhabit, that were taken from them. And doing this whole concept of indigenous restoration in California, I think is emerging. And the idea of a cultural landscape that's so common in Mexico I think is really exciting about the way we're going to approach landscape scale conservation from the coast and the ocean to the coast, the shoreline, all the way eastward to the mountains and deserts. So I'll stop there.
So we have about a little under 5 minutes left for this conversation. I think we could probably talk all afternoon about this, but some people would like to go for lunch. So maybe just briefly, kind of circling back to where we started with scale, but if you wanted to, each of you touch on, if there was a few key lessons that you wanted to share with people outside of the borderlands to understand, what value of this work is and what people could learn from it to take to other parts of the borderland or beyond, what would some of those ideas be? And John, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, there's the technical aspects when I think about reforestation, the fact that we deal with, just a large number of species that we're seeking to restore into these areas, these thorn forest, thorn scrub areas. That isn't, that has application. The processes themselves, the seed banking, that kind of thing, the storage, and then how you actually get that out to the growers. How the mechanisms by which you whether it's contracts, that kind of thing, whether those kinds of things that you get them out to them. Those are things that have application. I can see that within American Forest Landscape Restoration Program. We kind of piloted seed collection in South Texas, so that was That's a really important thing. But I feel like, and this goes, again, I have to refer to some of these conversations that have already gone on here at the symposium. It's like, you know, we're not everything that you see on the news channel. There's so many rich layers of you know, culture, more by the day, as more folks come this way. That's never going to stop, you know, to make this place their home. How do we incorporate those folks? How do we give them a sense of place, and if this is their new home, that kind of thing. So those are really important things that I kind of keep in front of me as we work through this on the community engagement, environmental literacy. We can't really do a restoration program, a site demonstration of restoration without folding that into what's even more important, which is the environmental literacy programming for folks that don't even, you know, have never experienced a thorn forest, you know, because most of them were eliminated before their parents were born or their grandparents. So it's almost like a reimagining of that whole concept. But that's what I would have to say.
Faye?
Yeah, I think I would just kind of go back to the importance of partnership and how critical it is to have different representation from groups kind of across the region where you're working. Because I think the big thing for me is that climate change and the impacts that we're facing in the Southwest more broadly are a lot, and they're daunting. And I think you can come up with bigger, more innovative ideas when you have more voices at the table and people are able to share some risk in thinking big and thinking about new ideas. And so I feel like those types of collaborative partnerships are just really important for getting to scale and for thinking kind of big and critically about how we can improve resilience.
Great. Serge?
Yeah, no, there's a moment as mayor when I was working, had the Marines and the Navy right next to the border when we had these caravans, and, you know, things were pretty tough for a lot of us who work on the border on partnerships and working across the border on good things like saving like topophilia and biophilia. And then when the border shut down, and I say that because I just want to acknowledge all our partners and those of us and everyone who's been working on these issues for decades, right? These deep NGO, civil society, academic partnerships that transcend the border, that transcend nationality, and are forged around our love for place and for ecosystems and wildlife, and the belief that we need to make this happen has been really inspiring despite all this. And I think it only sort of deepened our collective resolve to continue to work with each other and to support each other and carry out this work. It's more important than ever. We discovered that these are the key to helping us save the planet, like we always knew they were. And so now it's only deepened our resolve, and that leadership from below, when I think about the Colorado River, especially NGOs and civil society, leading our federal governments on both sides of the border and state and local agencies has been absolutely essential and, to me, inspiring as a conservationist. So I just want to thank everybody for that. And I know we'll continue working together. So thank you.
Wonderful. I think that's a perfect spot for us to stop. If you join me in thanking our amazing panelists.